Joining me now is Matt Duss, foreign policy advisor to Senator Bernie Sanders, who, of course, as a member of the House in 2003, opposed the invasion of Iraq, and journalist, author, and commentator Peter Beinart. He's the author of the Beinart Notebook on Substack. And though he supported the invasion in 2003 as editor of the New Republic, he spent the past decade critiquing that war and the mindset that has led America into endless wars. Thank you both for joining me. Peter, let me start with you. What are the lessons you think Vladimir Putin could be learning from our disastrous war in Iraq? And what lessons can we as Americans still learn from it that are still relevant today in 2022?
The first is that international law matters. There's a really deep wisdom behind the systems created after World War II to prevent aggressive war in the wake of the Nazis. And the United States violated that when it went to war without UN Security Council approval. And then Russia did the same thing in Ukraine. And one of the tragedies of that war, of the Iraq War, was that it weakened that crucial international norm. A second is that unbridled executive power is extremely dangerous. We know that Vladimir Putin was deeply isolated in the run-up to this war. George W. Bush wasn't as isolated, but he was quite isolated too. According to one report, he didn't even know the difference between Sunni and Shia Muslims in Iraq. And because there was very little congressional oversight by the Republicans in Congress, most of whom didn't even bother, or the Democrats, frankly, bother to read the classified national intelligence estimate, which supposedly proved that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, Bush had far too free a rein to make this kind of momentous decision.
Peter, I'm shocked to hear intellectual heavyweight George W. Bush was unaware of the intricacies of Iraqi politics and ethnic breakdowns. Matt, let me bring you in. A lot of people, the minute they even hear the word Iraq being placed in the same sentence as Ukraine, will shout, "Whataboutism! You're engaged in whataboutism." What do you say to them?
No, I think it's important to look at these lessons, as you said. And I think one of the most important lessons that we can draw, and that the leaders of both countries should draw, is that both Iraq and, both the Iraq War and Russia's invasion of Ukraine were conceived as demonstrations of great power. And they have achieved only in demonstrating the limits of that power. And I think that's one of the main lessons here. I would also just 100% agree with what Peter said about the value of international law. We have to understand the enormous damage that the U.S. invasion of Iraq, but more broadly, the global war on terror and all the policies that the United States the privileges that the United States arrogated to itself to violate a whole set of international law norms and procedures that had been painstakingly erected in the wake of World War II in the pursuit of its anti-terrorism policies, and the damage that did to the so-called liberal international rules-based order, or whatever term you want to use. And we really need to reckon with the United States' own role in weakening that order and commit to strengthening it if we really want to draw the right lessons both from Iraq and from Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Yes. And of course, Peter, there are, as I mentioned a moment ago, some obvious big differences between these two conflicts. We shouldn't overdo it, but the similarities still are stunning to me. It's why when my producers and I sat around the table saying, what should we do on the show, the similarities they almost wrote themselves. I mean, the claims of liberation, the assumption of a cakewalk, even the ridiculous post-facto WMD justification with all this biolabs nonsense.
Right. And one of the things that I think, Matt, and you mentioned, which is crucial, is the power of nationalism. It's true that Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator. Unlike Vladimir Zelensky, he was not elected by his people. Iraqis would have been much better with him and not having him there. But it turned out that even people suffering under a horrendous leader like Saddam Hussein did not appreciate being invaded by a country half a world away, and saw that as imperialism. And that is a really, really crucial lesson. One of the strange things about American politics is that we are such a nationalistic country, and yet we often find it hard to understand that other peoples are nationalistic too and don't like us meddling around and pushing them around and sending our military to tell them what to do.
And of course, Vladimir Putin, in the context of Ukraine, is writing long essays saying there is no such thing as Ukraine. And now he's witnessing Ukrainian nationalism at its best, I suppose. Matt, right now we have a lot of people in D.C., in both Congress and in the media, demanding the Biden administration do more, take a tougher stance, set up a no-fly zone. You work for Bernie Sanders. You're well aware of the debates that are going on in the hallways of power. And I wonder how dangerous is this kind of foreign policy groupthink that we see so often in D.C.? How dangerous does it end up being? You remember the climate in 2003, where people like your boss, Bernie Sanders, were seen as outliers for opposing the invasion of Iraq.
Yeah. No, I think you're always going to have a certain faction of foreign policy voices for whom the answer is always more escalation. It's a very easy argument. It's a very emotionally satisfying argument. And in some ways, it's unfalsifiable, right? Because if escalation doesn't work, well, the answer is always just escalate more. I have been encouraged. I would say, and I don't often say that when I'm talking about foreign policy discussions in Washington, with the way the Biden administration has made clear from the beginning, first of all, that we would not be sending U.S. troops, that NATO would not be involved here, and has pushed back, and a number of Democrats and others have pushed back on these proposals for a no-fly zone, making clear that this would be war with Russia. At the same time, I think making those lines clear has also created space for what is actually a pretty enormous amount of U.S. and allied support in terms of military aid to the Ukrainians in defending themselves. So I think the lines here have been pretty clearly drawn and communicated to Putin and to Russia, while at the same time continuing to support Ukrainians in defending their country.
Yes, and as I pointed out on MSNBC last night, this idea that if we don't support a no-fly zone, we haven't done anything is absurd. We are sending all sorts of military equipment every day. Joe Biden announced another $1 billion yesterday. This administration has done a lot. Peter, you and I were heavily criticized in the run-up to Russia's invasion of Ukraine for suggesting that NATO expansion may have helped bring us to this point and exacerbated this crisis, even though neither of us said it was the cause of the conflict or justified Putin's illegal invasion. So what do you make of the fact that now there's a potential peace plan, being discussed between Russian and Ukrainian negotiators in Turkey, which includes Ukraine maybe declaring formal neutrality and swearing off NATO membership forever?
Right. I mean, I think that this is one of the ironies. Is that Volodymyr Zelensky himself has for quite a while now been saying, we recognize that Ukraine is not going to join NATO. And Ukraine's not going to join NATO for the very reason that Matt was just discussing, which is that the United States will not commit itself to fight Russia with its own troops. And including Ukraine and NATO would commit us to do exactly that. Now, I think there is a legitimate question about whether you could have had a neutrality deal would have worked before the war, or do the Russians needed to have their nose bloodied by this extraordinary, heroic Ukrainian resistance in order? So I think reasonable people can disagree about that. But the notion that even suggesting that America made a mistake in 2008 when it offered Ukraine entrance into NATO, even though it knew it never really was going to follow through on that, something that was criticized by people like Fiona Hill, who was on Trump's National Security Council, I think that was a problem in the conversation we had before. There were things that members of the foreign policy establishment had been saying for years and years about some of the dangers of NATO expansion, that all of a sudden you became a Putin apologist if you said them last.
Yeah, it'll be weird if a final peace deal does involve that. Would that make Zelensky a Putin apologist? Just the whole discussion here in the U.S. was very bizarre. Matt, last question to you. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said today that if China's Xi Jinping directly assists Vladimir Putin with military equipment, China will bear responsibility for whatever Putin does in Ukraine. You tweeted, if this is the standard we're now applying, and I think it's a good one, we should be cutting off U.S. arms sales to quite a few countries. Which ones were you thinking about?
Well, I could run down a whole list, but one of the most obvious ones would be Saudi Arabia for the war they have been waging that has obliterated Yemen for the past more than 5 years. But I think, as a general principle, I agree with the statement from Secretary Blinken that selling and providing weapons and military equipment to Russia in this invasion would implicate China in what Russia is doing. I think that is quite right. I think that is a rule we should follow ourselves. And once again, this is certainly not a defense for Russia or China, quite the opposite. I'm just saying, if we want to establish a set of rules, it would be good if we held ourselves to those rules.
Yes, indeed. And if memory serves me correctly, in Obama's second term, there were State Department lawyers advising that State Department officials could be held legally accountable for Saudi's crimes in Yemen because of our approval of arms sales to Saudi Arabia. It's a logical point that Blinken makes. As you say, let's just be consistent. That's all I want. Consistency. Matt Duss, Peter Beinart, appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Mehdi Hasan. Thanks for checking out our channel on YouTube. You can see more of the Mehdi Hasan Show by clicking on any of the videos on this screen, and make sure you subscribe below to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. Thank you for watching.